So in this video, we're going to go a little bit more into building terrains using Houdini's terrain system than in some of my previous videos. We're going to cover creating that environment from the beginning. We're going to construct it using some procedural underlying geometry. We're going to use the erode system. We're going to look at some of the different settings on that erode system in order to help us art direct and get as many usable attributes for driving our materials so our textures are associated with the features of our terrain. We're going to use Unreal materials from the bridge, and then we're going to get this into Solaris and do some initial rendering, some basic setup inside of Solaris. We'll then use this later to then build up and do some environment work of scattering and take this all the way to a full-fledged environment. Let's get started. Okay, so first things that we want to do is we're going to go ahead and we're just going to create some containers here. I'm going to go ahead and be in the build setup for right now, and I'm going to drop down a geometry node, and we'll just call this, we're going to make a mountain, so I'm going to call this mountain, and I'll call this height field, because I'm going to split out my different kind of functions, my different processes into their own little container. So we'll just do that now. So we'll put down a geometry node, and this is going to be my height field. We'll say it's mountain geo, and that's where I'm going to separate. And then eventually, when I get to scattering, I'll have a geometry node, and I'll do mountain scatter. Now, you can do this in multiple places. We could just do everything in the stage. Oftentimes, I'll do this depending on the pipeline I'm working in, where I'm using Solaris, and everything is constructed right here at the stage, because that way I'm not jumping back and forth between different contexts, even though you really still are. But for now, we'll just stay in using Houdini's predefined context. So we're going to start with this. And so we're going to come into our height field. I'll drop down a height field node, and by default, it's going to give us a 1 kilometer grid. And that 1 kilometer grid is fine, except scale really does matter here when you're building terrain. So it affects how it looks when it simulates. And then once we have our terrain built, it really affects how we perceive the scale and size of that give So if you have a really small environment that's supposed to be really huge and the camera moves, the parallax will be wrong, and it won't give you the sense of what you're looking for. So it's really important to start with a proper scale. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just make this a little bigger. I'm going to make this 5 kilometers. And because I'm increasing that size, I actually want to reduce my grid spacing. You can see here I'm at over 6 million voxels. If we go back to the 1000, we'll see that we have quite a bit less. So we're down to 250,000. So we will upscale eventually, but for now, for speed, we're going to go ahead and reduce that grid spacing. So that's going to give us a nice little kind of a quicker response to this. So, all right. Building that mountain. Now you can use hand sculpting techniques with painting attributes. You can paint height and build stuff up. I prefer not to do that. The point of Houdini in my mind is to use as much proceduralism as possible. That doesn't mean to remove the artistry out of doing things and using your own kind of paint strokes and things like that, but some of those nodes can make your scenes very heavy and then also require you to go back and repaint and repaint and repaint and repaint. So I try to avoid them where I can. I use those as the last, trying to address notes at the very end, but I try to build everything as procedural as possible in the beginning. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop down a tube. This is kind of the default. The first input here, I'm going to make 0. The second one, I'm going to go ahead and we'll make this 1 kilometer wide at its base. And for the height here, we're going to make this 0.5 kilometer high. And what I usually do is I'll just copy this parameter, paste, and then divide by 2. And what that does is it makes it so my no matter what my height is, it's always on the ground. So otherwise, this is growing up and down at the same time. I just wanted to grow out of the ground plane. So there's my mountain. We're going to throw down a height field project node. There's our height field. And so we take a look at this, and we've got our little mountain in the middle. But this is fine, but I want to do something that gives me a little bit more before I start adding my noise, something that I feel is a little more art directable. So I'm going to go ahead and put down a grid. And for this grid, I'm going to go ahead and make it the size of my height field. Oops, sorry. Make it 5 kilometers in size. I'm going to put down a scatter node, and I'm going to scatter some points on this grid. And I don't need 1,000. I think I'm going to use something like let's use just 100. And then I'm going to go ahead and put a copy to points node. One thing before I hook anything up, I always like to pack an instance in case I go crazy and have too, you might accidentally, hook up a bunch of points to something and have really heavy geo, and then it blows up your memory and crashes your scene. So speaking of, good thing to always do at the very beginning. Let's go ahead and save our scene. Okay, so now if we take a look, we can just look here and see what we've got. Here's the scattering of these cones, which could be fine. You could plug this into the height field, and that's what you get. This, a little bit of interest there, but not quite what I'm going for. All right, so here we are. Now, one of the things that I want to do is I want to now say, okay, I want this to have a sense of a mountain. I'm just trying to create some terrain. So I'm going to take and put down an attribute wrangle, because I can control the scale of those points as they're coming off away from the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some parameters that I need. So I'm going to do a float, and this is going to be min equals channel float. We'll call it min. We're going to make a little UI. Float max equals channel float max. Then I want to find the magnitude. Basically, I'm looking for the distance from the center out. And we'll try a couple of things here. I have a few ideas of how I want to do this. So float, we'll call this magnitude, mag for magnitude. And the first way we could do this is we can say length and then say at p. And then let's just go ahead and take this and say f at p scale equals mag. And oh, everything disappeared. So let's pop open our geometry spreadsheet and take a look at what's happening here. Oh, our p scale is gigantic. So I'm guessing if I go back to my scene view here and scale out, there they are. They're huge. Okay, that's not what we want. So I'm going to come back to the tube here, and we're going to look at our points. There's our grid, and we can actually right-click here and say p scale, and it's going to give us a heat map. Right now everything's just atomic, so it's way hot. So let's try if we just normalize. I think that one's a vector. It does, so that's not going to work. What we want to do is let's just say fit, and we'll say length. And this is where we're going to use our min and our max that we've just set up. And we're going to remap this from 0 to 1. And let's go ahead and hit the button. And so now we get a 0 to 1. And let's take this, and this now is going to be, we saw before our p scale, like everything's just 1 now. We saw before if we were to go back, this was really high values. It's basically the distance away from 0 of each point. So some of these points out here can probably get as high as 5,000. So let's just put that in there as 5,000, and now you see we've got a nice kind of little heat map that's starting to fall off. So if we look at this, we've got kind of this look. And that's kind of the inverse of what I want. So the cool thing is, let's just take this whole thing and let's put this into a float, and we'll call this user dist equals, and we'll put a ramp that'll allow us to modify this. And so we'll just put magnitude, the name of the ramp is going to be user distance, and the attribute that drives that is going to be magnitude. And now instead of magnitude down here, we're going to use our user dist We're gonna hit the little button. It's gonna generate our ramp. That's the default, and we're just gonna go ahead and let's make it sharp, and let's reverse it. Not what I want. So let's do round and reverse it. Oh, there we go. That's kind of the feel that I'd like it to have. So from this, we can increase our points if we wanted something different, right? We could increase how many we get there. No, look, we got some that are really close to the middle. It kind of gives us that big mountain. That's not exactly what I want. At this point, though, I could just adjust, right, my field here to kind of find that right thing. So maybe it wasn't that I want to change this. Let's keep this at 100, because I think that's better. And that's feeling kind of cool. We could also just change the seed value on our points and just kind of not play around till we find something that gives us a little bit more what we want. I kind of like that guy right there. Let's do that. All right, so that's our new thing. We'll take a look, and there you go. So, you know, if I was to go and run this, the next thing I usually do is I'll put down that heightfield blur, and we're just going to take a little bit of the edge off of this. So that's a 10. Let's make this 25, and we see we just kind of softened up. I don't really care that there's polygonal faces for now. It might make for interesting stuff, so we'll leave it. You know, what the next thing is to start adding some noise. But before I do that, well, let's do that. So I'm going to drop down a heightfield noise, and heightfield. Sorry, that was distort by noise, heightfield noise. So these are the two, and we're going to look at this in two different orders. We're going to look at it this way, and we're going to look at it this way to see what our difference is. Okay, and there's not a right or wrong here. It's just preferences. So let's just hook these up. This is the cool thing about Houdini. You can kind of have these cool little chains of things. So let's take a look at this. Oh, interesting. It did some stuff. Maybe we want to leave it like that. One suggestion that this has, they say that the element size should be connected to the amplitude. That's not a rule. That's just if you kind of, you know, that gives you that general kind of, that's how it's supposed to look. So usually what I'll do is I'll copy this parameter and paste a relative reference there. Now I have kind of one thing that I'm scaling, right? So if we come all the way down here, you can see our original kind of stuff, and then I like to just pull out till I lose that kind of CG sense, and I start getting a sense of like, oh, there we go. That starts to feel interesting to me, right? Something maybe like that. Yeah, I like that. Then we're going to look at our curl here, our curl noise. And if you see it up top, this is the difference, right? So we go from this to this. It just kind of, in this way, adds this curl wave to it. Versus adding height, it moves things in the X and Y, right? So, or in the X and Z instead of in Y. Where the noise moves it in Y. Cool little combination there. So usually what I'll do is I'm going to increase the element size here, you know, something maybe like 500. And then I'll increase my amplitude. And I'll crank that up to like 200. Right? So when we look up here, this already starts to look more natural, right? Like it gives that sense of erosion. So I'm going to come back. One of the things that I like to do also is turn up the substeps. This is how much it divides each sub-step. It divides how much influence it has. So as you know, kind of come through here, there's less and less influence in the subsequent steps of the curl noise. So something like, so here's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's probably good. See, I like that. We might be a little extreme in our amplitude, so maybe I'm going to come back to 100. I think that feels better. That definitely feels better. Again, when you're doing it just like this, it's really about it's about what you like versus what's accurate, or you know, if you're trying to match something, that's something else. I'm going to take this moment to kind of come in here and say I like this view, and so I'm going to create a camera as well. So I'll just say new camera. That works great. So we've got our camera there. That way I can always come back to it. I'm going to jump into our height, back into the height field, and let's look at this same thing. I'm going to delete this I'll copy our current settings, paste it, and I'll just reverse these. So I'll just take this guy, pop him out, whoop, pop him in here. And we'll take a look at the results. So this is the one, and this is the other. Now the reason I like this way better is because here, when I look at this, the noise pattern that exists does not feel related to the shapes within the terrain that we've generated. It just feels like a pattern slapped on top. But when I look at this, it feels like those noises have been pulled through this pattern. So oftentimes what I'll do is I like kind of the result of both. So I'll add just one more little height field noise after our distort. Right? And I'll do the same thing, copy this parameter, paste relative reference. Let's come back to our camera here, cam 1. And so we look at that, and then we get this, and I don't want to change all the shapes of everything. I'm just trying to add that detail. So we'll do the same thing. We come back to 0, and then we just start kind of bringing this in to add something back on top, where we don't want to kill what we've got, just something like that maybe. So what we had was here, now what we've got is there, just a little something. And it may not make any difference at all. Depends on what scale you're simulating at. Oftentimes I'll do this again after my erosion. We're going to talk about that, and that I'll add those in. All right. One thing that I also like to do here is I like to maybe add additional features that I can kind of, start my original shape with something a little bit better than this. So let's try that. Let's kind of play with just adding in something. So we're going to use the scatter align node. Oops. And we're just going to drop this in right here. And what this is going to do is it's going to create points on top of our, oh, you know what? It's not, because this is packed. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and unpack this because I already know that I didn't have it that heavy. So with this scatter and align node, we'll see here, this is designed to be similar to the height field scatter, but working off of geometry versus working off of a height field. So there's similar kind of functions. What this allows us to do, it allows us to control the scale. It allows us to control the alignment. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down another copy to points node. And this is going to be our points. And then I'm going to put down a platonic solid. And what this allows me to do is pick some shapes that are maybe a little bit more interesting to scatter than, because again, it's just using procedurals. I'm just trying to be simple here. And so I'm going to throw that on here. And this is going to take a second because this is not packed. So I'm going to hit Control Z. Sorry. And first, let's look at this again. I'm going to change how much my coverage is. So I can do some scaling by attribute, which in this case, there's not enough point detail in there to really make that purposeful. So I'm just going to tell it number of points. And I'm going to go through and say, great, I want, 1,000 is probably too many. Probably going to do, let's do like 500. Let's do like half of that. So now when we look at this, there's these platonics. And you see they're kind of angled at different ways. This scatter align node allows me to then just kind of take this rotation and crank it up. Because really what I'm looking to do is I'm just looking to give me some random kind of stuff on this guy. Now, the part that went away when we switched to by number of points, which this to me seems to be a mistake on Houdini's bars. Here's our scale, yay! And then we go to density, and that's gone. Point by spacing, that's gone, and number of points, it's gone. So we need to be able to go in and add back in that, be able to control that. So we're just going to put down an attribute randomize node, very simple, and we're going to add in, instead of color, we're going to make it a single dimension, and we're going to make this p-scale. And that's on points. Oops. There we go. So we'll leave this at 1. And what we'll do is we'll just increase the size of our platonic. We'll make this size 50. And now we're going to actually just kind of slide all of this down to right there. We'll add a merge node. And we're just going to merge in this guy with this guy. And there you go. Now this is our result. So, and again, this just gives me the ability to come in here and, you know, we can adjust this radius to maybe 75. So we've got some interesting, you know, little breakups that are going to give some different faces. It looks dumb now. You're like, well, that's stupid. But don't worry, it'll look cool later. So we come back to here, and you see it gives us some kind of vertical faces. Those will make some interesting features later. I'm going to reduce this blur to 15. All right. Add our noise, add our distort, add our little final noise there, and there we go. Now we're ready to start doing our erode. Hit save. It's kind of a habit. So now I'm going to go ahead and do a heightfield erode. And let's talk a little bit about this node. There's a lot of features in this that do a lot of things, and you can get into and paint masks for every single thing, and it's very powerful. I find that I almost never need that level of flexibility. I'm going to go ahead and freeze the transforms here. This is something that is very important. That way, if you accidentally change the frame you're exporting on, or if this is feeding into another dynamic simulation, if you have this set not at frozen, then you're going to get a much different result out of this than you will out of having this frozen. So you'll have, like, the simulation will just be different because it's the first frame of this is not 20 anymore, it's an uneroded. So it's just a good habit. All right, so one of the things that I like to do is I just drop down the default one, freeze it at frame 20, and I take a look at my results and say, okay, well, what's that giving me? Now, when I'm learning to do this, I will actually drop down a bunch of these, right? And I'll change one thing at a time so I can get an idea over how the controls work on this. So, for example, oops, sorry, I pasted one node and it's lagging for a second. It's lagging because it's going through 20 frames to get me to this point. Okay. So usually what I'll do is I'm going to switch here from auto update to manual for now. But I'll come in and I'll pick kind of the one thing that I want to adjust first. So I always start with the main, right? And I make these adjustments here. And then eventually I'll go into the advanced and I'll make some of the adjustments here. And again, it really depends on what you're trying to do. So let's talk about bank angle, right? So they give us a great little feedback or a little tool tip here. Lower values will make wider rivers and flatter river channels, right? So that's that groove that it cuts in. Whereas a higher value is going to cut deeper and make a narrower angle. So let's try that. Let's just knock this way down, and we'll do 5, and we're going to reset that sim and then hit the manual recook button, and we'll see as that recomputes what that gives us. All right, so we ended up with kind of less of those waterways, right? Still similar erosion, but one of the things that, you know, I point out, like, it doesn't matter. Don't think of these as like it has to be water. These are giving you kind of controllers for mixing your materials later. So we can see that that's what the bank angle of 5 does, and if we just jump back over and look, right? So we can see here that it's increased how much sediment that it's carried. So it widened out that kind of debris field. The brown is debris, the blue is water, and then there's sediment which kind of runs inside of there. We can turn that visualization on right now. So we have water and debris. So let's make we'll make this color because there's not one already there of sediment. And so if we turn off the water, yeah, you can hardly even see the sediment. So it's there. It usually runs kind of in concert with the water. It's just a little bit further out past. Okay, so now if we go the other way with this and we make the bank angle, let's just max it to 90, right? Before I change that, I'm going to copy and paste and throw another one down. We'll put this back to 5, and this will give us the ability to kind of jump back and forth between all of these. I'll reset that simulation. We'll hit cook, give that a second. Cool, there you go. You can actually see more sediment here as well. All right, so we'll actually go back to this one too, so that way we can see on all of these, kind of have them set up all the same. So as we kind of step through this and we take a look at each one of these, now it's going to recook all these, and that'll be fun. Okay, so here's with our really low bank angle, right? So we see in here our bank angle is 5. This is our default. Oh my goodness, it's going to cook them all. Right, not a huge change there, just how much kind of sediment is getting deposited. Well, I guess it's substantial enough. And then we see here that we just end up with different water and kind of sediment settings here. So that's one thing to play with, right? The other thing that I'll play with here is going to be the spread iteration. We'll do one more. Let's do one more with erosion rate. So we're gonna copy this and we'll paste down our default. We'll come back here, so it's our default, and let's just crank our erosion rate up. And we'll take a look at that. So with that, compared to our default, right? So we just took our standard, and I think what we're getting is some extra channels in here. As more material erodes, it's pulling things down the mountain, so it causes more branching and forking in some of these areas, right? So we can see kind of how that reacts. This is strange. Okay. Now the next thing that you can play with is this spread iteration. Now I'm going to come back and just kind of hijack this one again, and we'll use the same number. I liked how this turned out with our higher erosion rate. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to reduce this. So the more spread iterations that you have, the more that the water will want to kind of find itself. So like these would all kind of merge into one thing. You don't get these kind of parallel rivers. And then the lower should be a greater number of those. So we'll reset our simulation. All right, so we're starting to get kind of more stuff up in here as it's the erosion rate, the spread iterations. We're getting more of these kind of little channels here. And let's go down to, let's crank it. I should have done this as a separate node, but the copy and paste process was too long. The number of iterations is going to slow down how long it takes to compute, because obviously it's doing more iterations. There you go. So like it was saying, the higher these numbers are, it finds the really kind of the more correct and natural places for these rivers to kind of flow. The other one gives you more stuff happening, more results, where it's all these little channels. But the reality is you're not going to get rivers kind of running next to rivers. They're going to find their way to each other and become one thing. So this is probably a better result than you would get otherwise. So it depends on the look that you're going for. So we're going to leave that up there. Let's look back at this bank angle versus this bank angle. Let's try one last thing. We're going to reduce our bank angle here from 70 to 15. And let's take a look. Again, I go back to what I'm looking for is I'm looking to have variation in the different attributes of the surface. Those are going to be really critical when you go back to adding your shaders to this. The reality is in the mountains, everything is not steep slopes. There are areas where you have buildup of sediment, and it builds these areas of kind of softer features, and these are really useful for creating, this might be a rock texture up here, but then down in this area would be something that feels much finer, like a buildup of something. Or this is also where you're going to scatter in your trees and your grasses, or find those things. All right, so between those two, I don't feel like this gave me a lot of stuff that I'm really excited about. You see that we kind of filled in all of our little river lines there. So I'm actually going to go back and I'm actually going to increase this, and we're going to make this 85. And now we're going to look at cut angle. So to do that, I'm going to jump back to our original, and I'm going to turn this to manual, copy and paste. And let's just look at cut angle and erosion rate on this. So erosion rate is how much that it pulls material away, and then the cut angle is how much it flattens out the features, right? So, whoops. So let's take this cut angle and let's drop this down to like 5. We're going to take a look, switch back to mouse up. While that's cooking, this kind of process is one of the things that always makes me the most, one of the things I find to be the more powerful elements of Houdini is being able to continually break off new branches and experiment where there's no undoing that I need to do. I'm not duplicating a bunch of geometry. It's just really simple. All right, so let's take a look at our original, and then we'll take a look at this this new version. You can already see here before it jumps back how much more sediment that we've got. We've rounded off a lot of our features in our mountains. And that's not right or wrong, it just depends on what you're going for. All right, so this is maintaining a lot of the original structure that we established, and then this is allowing for a lot more of this kind of build-up in between. So I don't think that's the angle that I want, but now let's go ahead and take a look. I'll just copy and paste this one here. It's going to do a cook again. I'll hit escape because we don't care. And for this cut angle, I'm going to do something extreme and say 80. And what you'll see here is there's going to be little to no buildup of sediment from the thermal erosion, thermal being wind, right? So this is simulating wind erosion. The hydro part simulates water erosion. And you can see here now, this is very much our original height field that we built out, and then just some water lines cut. So again, depending on what you're wanting to do, you have kind of these two different extremes. I'm going to keep it at the base that it was, because I felt like going lower was too much, and then being higher was not enough. So we'll see here as we jump. Those are those extremes. So all right, so these are our different extremes, and then this is kind of our middle. And maybe with this I want to come a little bit so I get a little more of that erosion in there. Maybe not. We'll stay here. Okay, at this point is when I would start dialing in my advanced stuff, if I'm using this as my only erosion. But I'm not going to. I'm going to do one more. So I'm going to leave this the way it is. I'm going to go ahead and take all of these, and we're just going to go ahead and delete them because I don't care about those anymore. You could leave them. You could tuck them off to the side. I just don't need them anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those. Okay, so once I've hit this point, I will use a height field resample. And what I want to do is I'm going to double my resolution scale. So if we take a look here and we look at the information, we were operating at 1.5 million voxels, which is probably pretty high. We could have toned that down a bit, and now we're at 6 million. And this is fine. It's totally fine to have it like this. Again, the only purpose of this is you use this to kind of rapidly get to a point where you're happy, and then you'll upscale. For a lot of these things, the lower resolution, if we were to run this on like a background piece back here, the lower res is going to be adequate. It's only when you need that greater detail as you get closer. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and put down another height field noise, and we're going to kind of kiss some stuff back into this. So we're going to push that a little bit. Same thing. I'm going to copy this parameter, paste relative reference. We're just going to put a little bit of goodness back in there. That looks good to me. And you can always change the type of noise that this is. You'll get a different result. It just depends on what you're trying to go for. So I find that I'm almost always using the sparse convolution. I think that does just fine for me. Simplex is another one that can look all right. This is too high, but let's do the sparse convolution. All right, so we've added a little bit back in, right? We were here, now we're here. And then I'm going to do that same thing where I'm going to do a height field distort by noise. There we go, just rough that up a little bit. Okay, so now we got some stuff. Now, with both of these, with the height field noise, I'm fine to leave that just at height. But with the distort, I'll actually go in and add these other layers, because you can give it a grouping of layers. So we're going to say height, and then we're going to say debris. Right, so now it's done both of those. So if we were to take debris off of here, you see that that debris shifted, right? So we're going to say debris, water, sediment, and I think that's all we need. I don't care about the bedrock or the mask because we're not using those yet. So there. So now that everywhere that it got pushed or manipulated, that was run through and that distortion as well. So that way all the layers stay in sync with each other. Because if you have some pretty extreme distortions and you're not doing this, you'll actually disassociate your different channels from each other. All right, now here's the fun part, is we're going to come in and we're going to add another height field erode. So we're going to put down a height field erode node. And with this one, I'm just going to throw in some values. We're going to push that bank angle up. We're going to reduce our spread iteration down, and I'm going to crank up our cut angle. We're going to play with this one and see. We'll see what that gives us. So now we're going to take a look. That didn't seem to run. Oh, and we're going to freeze. Now with this one, I'm not going to, we'll try it at just 10 at first, and we'll see what the difference is. So 10, we'll run it for a little bit, and then we can always up that to 20 if we want. Anything beyond 20, you're really not seeing any difference. It converges pretty fast. All right, so there we go. So I'm starting to like some of this stuff. There's some cool kind of features happening in here that look really good. I'm gonna go ahead and let's just already go to 20. See if that changes enough to care. Because ideally, if you can get away with 10, do 10. I like 20 better. We get just those masks, those mats that we're gonna be using become a little bit more defined. So that's great. Let's try changing our spread iterations. I don't love this because it's gonna make it a lot slower, but let's try. So we're gonna, maybe we'll do this. Oh yeah, okay. So before we have a lot more things kind of running around, and like we talked about before, when we increase that, it finds really the more natural ways for those to flow. Now, in this particular case, I actually like this one better than this height field. So a good thing to test, right? It's kind of it's more of a feeling than it is this is the answer. So we're going to stay here. This will be our way forward. I'm going to delete this guy. And now we're going to come over here to advanced. So the first thing that we're going to play with is the river bed and the river bank. So the river bed is going to have to do with how deep these cuts get formed, where the river bank is the width of these pathways as they go, right? So depending on how much we allow it to erode and deposit. So if we start with the river bed, just taking a look at these, this is the rate at which the sediments turn into debris. Okay, so this is the one that usually I play with here, is the erosion rate factor. So by reducing this value, what it's going to do is it's going to not make the water, it won't cut the bed as deep, right? So some of these channels you can see feel like they get cut really deep within the mountain. So we can come in here and reduce this, and that's going to give us less of that kind of cut. These other two I usually leave the same. And then for the riverbank, I'll do the opposite. So this erosion rate factor, the greater that you make this, the wider it's going to cut out those riverbanks, right? So it's going to run through and cut those deeper. And then okay, so let's go ahead and reset this sim and let it run. All right, so some tiny changes. They're not huge, right, at this point. Again, this is fine tuning to get that the way we want that to look. So, a few additional little fine riverbanks we're starting to see here. Some of these became a little softer. Here, you could see where the water was cut in, and now it's not as deep, right? So this causes it to not cut as deep of an edge, which I prefer, because oftentimes due to the resolution, you'll get kind of this like Morse code almost of rivers where it's like dot, 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 where there'll be parts that are high and parts that are low due to resolution. Now, the last thing that I'll usually do is I'll come down here to precipitation. You can play with raindrop settings. I don't use them too often, but I'll come down here and I'll change the amount of water, and I'll change the density and then the evaporation rate. I'll reduce this. That will allow the water to persist longer. And then I'll decrease the density. So we'll see here that like the smaller number gives more erosion lines. So if I want more rivers and things kind of running through here, where we've got this nice setup where it tries to find the convergent rivers, which is what we want. We don't want a bunch of parallel rivers. We've gotten that down to a good place. Now by reducing this density, we'll get more rivers, but we won't get those like weird like rivers right next to each other. And then the last thing I'll do, depending on how much I want, I'll just crank how much precipitation that I want to give. So then we'll just rerun this simulation. There you go. So we can see here how much we've gotten a lot more water. And again, these are masks that I'm going to use to be able to drive some of this. Now, the part that we've lost here is we've lost some of that sediment buildup. And I do want some of that. I don't want this just to be rivers. I want some of that, that erosion to kind of build up as it goes. So I'm actually going to come back over here to our main, and the cut angle is what kind of does that. We cranked this up. I'm actually going to bring this back down, so I think the default on this is, I think, 35. We'll just revert that, so we'll say revert to default, yeah, 35. And let's just run that. So instead of that really high cut angle, and we'll see if we get a little bit more of that debris, because I want the water and I want some debris to build up in these areas, so that way we have interesting masks to play with. And again, don't think of these as rivers. See, that's much better. So, some of these are going to give some really nice different materials that we can apply. That'll feel good. We do get some pretty wide stuff happening in here. So I would probably come back to the advanced now, and where we were taking this down so we would get a wider, I'm sorry, not that. We were cranking this up to get a wider river. Maybe we'll revert this back to the default here and see if we get something that with the additional water volume is good, but we'll get, maybe a little bit finer of a river. Because here, this is like, that's like a lake running down the side of that mountain. So it's a bit much. And again, it's not actual water, but, I'll use this for snow, I'll use this for glaciers, and then in these areas, I'll use it for sediment, rock and gravel and those kind of things. So now is the fun part. Now we're going to start worrying about adding some additional channels to help us shade this, right? To really make this look amazing. All right, so it's really simple to do. I use a lot of the heightfield mask by feature, and I'll come through and do several of these. And then I'll use a copy layer node, and I'll take whatever the mask that I generate, and I'll copy it from mask into a new name. So in this case, we're going to use the slope, but we're going to get rid of the kind of the setup that they have, and we're going to make it, something like this. And now we're going to come through and find kind of the angles that we want to isolate just those like the vertical most faces, right? So these are going to be areas where like, these are cliffs, so these are the ones that are going to be rock no matter what. We're not going to have vegetation growing on this. We're not going to have, snow build up on this. So something like that probably we're going to say, and again, no right or wrong here. It's about feeling, something like that. So I'll call this slope. So this is going to be our slope mask, okay? And then I'm going to just copy this whole setup here, copy and paste it. And for this one, instead of slope, I'm going to use direction on this. So we'll use direction. And this is going to be, mountains will have in the northern hemisphere, their southwest quadrant is going to be the most arid. Their northwest or northeast quadrant is going to be their wettest, so it's going to have the most vegetation. It's where the most snow will be. And so I don't know what north, south, east, or west is here, but I'm just going to pretend. And I'm going to say that I want my sun to be coming in from this side, and I want over here to be kind of more of my, my facing. This is going to be my, something like that. So same thing with this. I'm going to delete this kind of weird excess that they create there. And then we're going to play with our spread angle. And then I can just tighten this up a little bit. There we go, something like that. I don't want a lot of graduation. I want it to be kind of either on or off. That's how I prefer it to function. Okay, so now I'm going to copy and paste this again. And, oh, before I do that, this is not slope. This is going to, I'll just call this direction. It's my direction mask. And now this one, I'm going to turn off the direction mask. And for this one, I'm going to turn on occlusion. And I'm going to come down here, and my occlusion is, I'm just going to go ahead and reverse these. I'll drag that here. I'll come back, and there we go. So this now gives me kind of these little cratery areas that I can use. You know, we'll see what this makes sense for. Again, it's a mask to be able to play with as I'm building. So we're going to call this one occlusion, and I'm going to copy and paste this one. And now this time I'm not going to actually turn off the occlusion part. Well, I'll turn it off for a second, but then I'm going to turn it back on. So I'll turn off occlusion. I'm going to turn on peaks and valleys, and same thing. I'm going to delete this silliness. And for the range, I'm going to reduce that to like 1. Oh, and see, this is capturing our peak, so I'm actually going to take this value and flip it that way. So now it's giving me down kind of in those little valleys. You know, I can just kind of play with this. So now that I've got that kind of set, and I know, whoops, I don't want another knot, thank you. I can kind of play with those. I'm going to actually turn back on my occlusion. And now you'll see that if we were to compare our occlusion to this one, there's just a different set of details. And I don't know which one I want right now. So I'm going to make both, because it just kind of gives me that ability to, oh, nugget, come in here and play with those, right? So one might be correct, the other might be correct. It depends on the mask that I'm needing to generate. We'll see. So, okay, now I have one more to create. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this setup again, and I'm going to pull this off to the side, and I'm going to use a heightfield layer node, and I'm going to plug this input here and then this input there. And what I'm going to replace is I'm going to replace, in this case, this is going to be called elevation. And so we'll come here and we'll just say elevation. So what I want to do here is I'm going to take this mask, and instead of using curvature, I'm going to go ahead and say this is going to be by height. And we can compute the range here, and it'll give me this. Turn off the occlusion. We're going to, same thing, get rid of that silliness. We'll open it up like this. And this is going to make my setup. Actually, I'm going to change this. I'm going to take this out and move this here. And this is going to be mask. That way we can see it. So if we look here, it's just doing what it's doing here. So here's the trick. I'm going to do a height field noise, and I'm going to plug this in up here. Let's disable it for a second. And right now, I'm going to go ahead and make an adjustment here. I'm going to set this to be 200 and 210, so I get a nice little kind of cut. Oh, let's make it less than that. Let's make this 75 and 100. Yeah, I like that. It grabs a couple little caps there. So now if we look at that, and now let's come back here and look at our height field, and we'll re-enable this. And oh, that's interesting, because what happened was we changed the height value of this. We created a mask off that value, and now we're plugging this back in. The cool thing about this is now if we come in here, we can adjust our how much roughness, and it breaks up that edge a little bit more. We can change the amplitude and the size if we want, and break these things out. It just gives us a lot of control. Let's take this down to 85, something like that. And once it's here, if you don't like it, you can just offset, and it'll make changes. So you'll see how that makes adjustments. We can do the same thing here. I'm going to copy this parameter and paste relative reference, and now I can kind of just come in here and start making adjustments to what feels good in that, right? So as we get lower, it's going to kind of maintain this line, which I'll tell you, living close to mountains that get snow, it does do this. When you get a snowstorm run in, there'll be this like fascinatingly straight line across the mountains. So I don't know that I want to go too dramatic in breaking that up, although visually it's a little more pleasing to have something kind of like this, right? We just kind of find something that works. So there we go. So this is going to be my elevation. Maybe not quite that. I think that's better because we're hitting some of our high peaks. Okay. So this is going to be my elevation mask. It does some interesting things. I can come in and play with more roughness, reduce the number of octaves. There's just all kinds of things that we can do here to kind of make this feel interesting. So, all right. Now that that's set, here I'm going to go ahead and put an output node down, and this is going to be the output of my height field for now. Okay, so now we're going to go and jump into our mountain geo, and we're going to start prepping this for rendering. So we're going to put down an object merge, and we're just going to pull in our height field. So I always do a relative path, that way if things get moved around, it'll still work properly. So now it's brought in our height field, and the reality is I want to be able to convert this into geometry, then send this into Solaris. Solaris, when you import height fields, will convert them if you check a checkbox into geometry. The reason I don't do that is because I want to have the ability to make those adjustments on my own. So I'm going to go ahead and put down a it's convert height field, and I'm just going to copy and paste this so I have two of them. And so this one here, height, I'll leave the density at 1, and this one I'm going to set my density to 0.1. So you can see there, you got a lot of great mesh detail. It's pretty heavy, right? So I think this is 6 million polys. Not obscene, but it's decently heavy. I mean, when you go to displace that, it's going to, you know, give you some pushback on you a little bit. But if we change this to 0.1, we get a much lower resolution. So I'm actually going to go 0.05. Nope, I'm going to go 0.2. Yeah, 0.2. There we go. And I'm going to put down a couple of outputs here. So I'm going to put down output, and we'll call this output high. We'll call this render. Output proxy. And I'll probably put in like some LODs to this as well, right? So that way I can set later. We'll get to that later. But we'll go to a point where we're building LODs to make this as render as nicely as we possibly can. Okay. So now at this point we've got our geo set up. Let's bring it into Solaris and see how it comes in, and then we can start figuring out what we need to do here to make this more usable. So we're going to jump on out, and we're going to go over to our stage, and there's two different ways. We can use a SOP import, and we can use a scene import. Now, because we have multiple outputs inside of our SOP, and we want to be able to choose which one we're using, we're going to use the SOP import instead of the scene import. So that gives us a little bit more control. Well, actually, no, we'll use the scene import on this. Let's see what this does. I'm doing this a little on the fly here. So under objects, we're going to come here and we're going to say mountain geo. Let's say accept pattern. Spacebar. Did that come in? It's giving me a warning. It's probably because there's two outputs in that it's getting angry. So let's see here. Maybe we don't want to do this. Maybe we are going to use SOP import, and we're going to do two pieces for this. So we're going to go in here and we're going to grab our render. Let's start with our proxy. Oh, one thing when you're using output nodes, you have to tell it which index. So one's got to be index 1 and the other one's got to be index 0, and you just got to set it up. Okay, so there came our proxy. That's great. We're going to switch our desktop over to Solaris so we can see we've got this beautiful SOP import, and that is some ugly naming. That is terrible. We don't want that. So one thing that we can do here is we're actually going to, instead of doing this by hand, we're going to use the component builder. So what component builder does is it drops down a handful of nodes to help us make really a little USD asset, which becomes very useful. I try to build things each in their own file and then create these little USD assets so that I can then load them in. So I'm not doing the computation at every frame and every load to save me some input there, some complexity. So in this case, it has an internal imported files, external SOP, or referenced files. So we're going to leave it as the internal SOP network. So if we click on this, we see here that we've got this nice little setup where we have our output and a proxy and a sim proxy. And we don't really care about this sim proxy for right now, but we're going to go ahead and do our SOP. Let's do an object merge, and because this is just now regular SOP context inside of Solaris, which is great. So we'll come out here to our object, and the first thing we're going to grab, let's grab our render. Let's export relative path. You can see there that that's not a relative path, but I always do that just by habit. So okay, so there's our render geo. I'm going to copy and paste this over, and this is going to be our proxy. You know, I suppose we probably could have pulled in the geometry right in here, or the height field right in here, and done this work here, and that would have been fine as well. So now I'm going to jump back out to stage here, and we're going to see how this builds. So we have asset geo, under proxy we have height, and under render we have height. Okay, that's pretty cool. I want to go ahead and just, you know, I'm going to pin these because I want this to kind of be persistent so I can see what happens when I make the change. I'm going to go back into my object. I'm going to go into my geo here, and I'm going to put down a name attribute, right? And we'll call this mountain. And what I expect now is that's going to pick that. Oh, it didn't. Let's see here. Oh, because I'm not supposed to change it there. I'm supposed to put it here. And there we go. So we're just going to copy and paste this over. And so now that's really simple. And so this is how we control the name, right? Because it's not like Maya where we can come in here and right click and say, you know, change name, or, you know, we can't, you know, click on this and change it. This is just a view of the USD composition. But now we've got this great little setup. So we can add attributes here. We can do whatever we need to do to the geometry to make this ready. And again, we probably could have done this right in the component builder. That would have been fine, but that's fine. We have this broken out this way. So we'll come back into the stage. And now if you'll notice here that we're seeing, you know, both of these are turned on. They're both set to display, but we see this kind of low res. So if we come here and we do Karma XPU, you can see that's very much our high res geometry that we're seeing, right? So it's, the benefit of this is you have proxy geo, which helps us at the display time, but then at render time we switch to our higher resolution geometry. So really helps with efficiency to build this way. Okay, so now let's get back into setting up our materials now. So I've got a material that I've kind of already loaded together and I haven't done anything with, so I'm just going to copy that out of another file, and I'm just going to drop this in here. And what I'll do is I will bring things over from the bridge into my Houdini session, and I'll just load in a whole bunch, right? And so then in this case, once they're all loaded up here, I'll take and I'll do a layer link, because it's going to put them, it puts them in your material network. It drops them in here. And so I'll layer link them all up. I go to edit, I select all the nodes and say collapse into selected into material. So then when it does that, it makes this, you know, little collection. And then I can come inside and it's all set up properly. And now I can start building out how I want this shader to behave. So I try to group things. So in this case, I have kind of my snow shaders. I have ice because I'm gonna do like a glacier. And then I have ground cover. This is things that are like mosses and rocky ground, these things that can feel much smaller scale. And grass, which I'll use. And then my large scale kind of rock stuff, which I'll use for the mountains. Okay, so now it comes, let's assign this material. So we're gonna come back out to our stage. So we're just gonna take this, and this is all fine. I'm gonna leave this as it is. The thing that I'm gonna change is the primitive. So I'm gonna grab both of these primitives and drop them in, oh, come on, and drop them into the primitives that I want. And then the material path, at this point, I can just click and there's that mountain, and I'm gonna say, okay, it's a little easier to see it than to have it be the Houdini pathing system. The reason that I do this is because if you insert any node into the chain, it will mess up because it's looking up to, you know, the next thing. So I find this easier to just expressly say this is what I want you to do. So under the advanced stuff, I don't worry about that. But now we've got this material coming in and making the assignment. So this builds them. It creates a material container here. So when we look at the way this is set up, there should be Oh, I've got this pinned still, sorry. Now let's come into our mount material and let's start kind of figuring this out. To start, I'm going to break some of these connections and just start with some very simple. So I'm going to start with using my elevation, so I'm going to say bind, and I'm going to use that elevation channel. So if we look, I'm going to come back out to the stage. I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to pin this because this will help us when we look at our mountain. We can come in here and look at the different attributes that we have to play with, right? So it'll help me to remember what the name of everything is. So in this case, we're going to use the elevation, and I'm going to go ahead and plug that into this alpha. And for that, I'm just going to start with one shader each. So I'm going to pull off this topmost snow and plug that into A, and then I'll go down to any old rock and plug that into B. Now, when I say Karma CPU, we'll let that render and we'll see what we get. Okay, so I jump back in here. Some stuff was hanging up and taking a really long time as I went through this. So I threw a couple things in here to try to sort that out. So one thing is I put a render geometry setting node on this. As like before, I pointed it at the specific primitives that I wanted to make the adjustments on. Render geometry settings allow you to change all kinds of things from motion blur, sampling, limits, so you can custom to each object's needs. So if you have something that requires more refraction, you can increase its refraction limit. So instead of doing it across globally on the entire scene, you can do it on a per object basis, which should speed up rendering. When we scroll all the way down to dicing, then we can turn off true displacement, which treats displacement as bump, and we can turn down or turn up the displacement. So the higher this value, the more micropolygons that get generated. So when that didn't fix it, I jumped inside of my shader to take a look, and the file had crashed while I was paused, and I reopened. And so it didn't have this elevation node set up, and it was piping all of these in and doing all of those displacements. And lastly, this properties node had been set. There was an expression in here that was evaluating to 0. And so I've removed this and just set it to a value of 0, 1. There was an expression in that node that was giving an unexpected result. So it was looking for channels that didn't exist on the main container. So it was looking for some displacement settings here that just aren't there. So when we come back inside, let's pick back up where we left off here. So we've applied a singular snow shader and a singular jagged shale beach rock to kind of figure things out. One last thing to help us see a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and put down a dome light. And I can put in a HDR. HDRs are really slow, so I'm going to put this in, but then I'm going to go right to this directory, which doesn't appear to be there anymore. So I have all of these shaders. I'm going to use the RAT version of this instead of the HDR, so this has been converted, which should make this a little bit better. So now we're just going to plug in right here. Again, I'm not putting it in between. I don't want this baked into my asset. And transform. That looks fine. I can throw one more light in this, so I'll put down and we'll make this a distant light. We'll make the exposure on this is going to be dependent on the angle. Makes a bigger sun, which will increase the intensity. Let's take a look what that looks like. Yeah, that feels fine. If we want, we can goose a little color in there. Why not? Right? Make it feel kind of have that evening tone. Gives it a little roll off there. We'll probably back this down just a little bit. Come back to 10. Well, let's split the difference. Everybody's favorite term. Okay. Last thing, I'm just going to put a little negative for translation there. Let's go -8. Awesome. And then we'll rotate the whole thing. And I think I want this to be this order. We'll rotate this 90 degrees. Great. That's actually probably more correct. 130. Yeah, 130. That looks great. So I still don't have my camera in here. I'm going to use a scene import node. And we'll just say cameras. And we'll drop it in right here. And then I can look through cam 1. And there's my, oh, yeah, I don't want that. That's a little not what I want. So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to put down a transform node to show you kind of the goofiness of how this all works. The transform node has to come after these things are created. And then I can just tell it what I want it to use. And so I'll just grab this lights primitive. And now I can rotate this whole lights kind of primitive. You know, we'll rotate it -45 or something like that. And we'll view that. And so that's essentially turning like the light rig, you know, we can rotate that around. So, all right. So now that we're set up there, we can kind of pin ourselves. Let's come in and look at what our different setup, what we're trying to do with our shader here. So firstly, I'm going to invert this. So I want my rocks to be coming from here, and I want my snowed to be coming here. Whoops. Right? Awesome. Ta-da! We got snow on the top and rocks on the bottom. We're going to start there. So this feels good. Now, I want to start building this up and kind of figure out one side at a time of this. And so I'll probably just bypass this. I can hit Alt left click and put a knot there. And now I can kind of, you know, connect this anywhere and it'll do the right thing. Okay. So first, let's work on our lower area. So first things first, I want to define what is going to be my kind of my rock area and what is going to be, you know, my ground area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put down a what assets? Let's see here. We're going to come back out for a second, and we're going to select right here, and we're going to pin this again because I want to be able to see my different primvars that I can use, right? So we created slope, we have water, we have all kinds of things. So we're going to use, let's start with slope. And so in this first layer mix here, I'm going to put down my bind node again, and this is going to be slope. And we're going to make changes to this in a bit, but for now, this will be slope. And so wherever slope is white, that's what we want going into the B input. In this case, we'll use this rock here. And so into A on this one, because whoops, we're going to put in wild grass for right now. And I'm just going to go and plug this whole thing into my dot. And so there now we can see that we have all this wild grass, and then we have this kind of rock thing going on. Now, as you can tell, like the scale of these feels really silly, not correct. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select the, oh, I didn't want to do that. Select the wild grass and the jagged rock. I'm going to come over to settings and I can adjust the UV tiling in this. This only works in this shader context, and we're going to rebuild these shaders in a later lesson to use Material X. But for right now, it's a nifty little trick. So we're going to say 0.1 and 0.1, and we'll see that we get a repeating pattern out of these now. Oh, it did not do it, so let's restart. Oh, because it only did it on the rock, I didn't get it on the grass. All right, so there, that's more of what I kind of am looking for. And if you look at this, it just gives the sense of being, you know, distant mountain and whatnot. And again, we don't have displacement turned on any of this stuff yet, so we're just working fast. So slope works for that, but I want to layer up my rock to add some other rock into some of this area. So what I'm going to use is I can use my elevation. I really kind of should have a second elevation, which is, you know, like, you know, just these most bottom areas. So let's go make that. Let's go make that. Let's go ahead and we're going to unpin this. Go to stage, object. We're shy one kind of material. We want to kind of get that lower elevation non-vertical. So we're just going to come down in here and we'll add another one right here. So we'll do a height field by feature, mask by feature, and we'll do a height field copy layer. We're going to call this floor. And again, you can call it whatever you want. I'll reselect this. We are going to use the mask by slope. I'm going to get rid of kind of this little setup that they have here. And we're just going to take this and invert this. And so this is going to give me, you know, the kind of the bottom angles that we want. So we can come down here and kind of cull out the stuff that's on the mountains. And again, let's just find the value that makes the most sense. Yeah, something like that's starting to feel interesting. It's amazing that jump that it makes between those two. So we'll start with something like this. Now, I don't really want it up in here. I really just want it down in these kind of valley areas. So this is where, again, we can combine and use the height, right? We'll compute range here. And get rid of that. Now, you'll see how slow Houdini is running right now. The reason it's running so slow is because we have this geometry scene graph open. So if we turn this off and we switch back to the build setup, it'll actually run faster because now it's not computing and having to send everything back to Solaris. All right, so now with this set, we're gonna do the same thing. I'm just gonna flip this around, and you can see here that we're able to kind of come in and figure out what we want for that. So this is already kind of like, all right, that's the general idea. But again, like I said, I don't want to use this straight line. So we're gonna do this kind of same gag here, and I'm just gonna copy this height field noise, and I'll paste it here. I'm going to copy this height field mask by feature, and then for this one, we're going to turn off the mask by height. And for this one, we're going to turn off the slope, and now we're going to do a height field layer, and we're going to replace the mask layer. All right, so if we look here, and we see now we've got that nice broken up edge. And now on this one, instead of using replace, we're going to say multiply. And so now we've got that same kind of valley floor that we've been able to isolate, but we also don't have that kind of straight line. So it gives us this nice little breakup. And so this will give us the ability to come in here and make some adjustments to this and get something really nice. We can make some additional kind of slope adjustments here if we want to capture a little bit more. You know, a little bit more of that valley floor, which I think we do. So we'll do something like that. And then this last one is floor. So, you know, now that we've got that, we're great. We could do this same thing and just create some general noise if we wanted to have some additional breakups. Let's do one of those. So we're going to put down a height field mask by noise and a copy layer node. So we'll view this one here. It's going to show us our noise. We can do sparse convolution. We can do whatever we want. Let's look at maybe Worley for our pattern here. And instead of add, we want this to be replace. And then, you know, we can push up on our amplitude here. If we do that under post-processing, we want to make sure that this clipping is set. And we can do some interesting things here to kind of make some adjustments to that, but we'll kind of go with this. Let's see what we can get here. This has a nice look to it, right? There's kind of these, you know, bands and patterns that we generate. That's nice. That's nice. Just trying to see if we can push up and get a little more break up to those edges. There we go. That's starting to do some fun stuff. Fascinating that roughness doesn't do anything. Gain, we'll push that, you know, one way or the other. Push it high, and then we have bias there that we can, you know, make adjustments there as to like where that cut happens. So maybe we'll do something like this, and then we're just going to call this, I'm going to call it general noise 1. And so now I can go in and add more later if I want, right? So I can have multiple of these if I want to. You can do this same thing in the shader. You will get better control at shading time than you will this, because this is data stored on the points where the shader can interpolate across micropolygons. So this is less effective. It's just easier to visualize. So we'll go with this way for now. So we're going to jump back out. We've got 2 new toys to play with. That's really exciting. We'll go into the stage. We're going to switch back to our Solaris setup here, which is great. And there we go. So now let's jump into our shader. And now that we have this, we can take this setup, and instead of using slope, we're going to change this and we'll use floor. And I think we might actually have to reverse these 2 inputs, right? Yep, as we do. There is a hotkey for that. I just don't remember what it is. I think I just did the same thing. I did. All right, undo. There we go. And this is going to be our A input. Awesome. So before we move on, now that we've kind of gotten these two things broken out, let's work on just one of them. So I'm going to work on the floor here. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and take some of these layers. So we've got this mossy forest floor, dry rocky ground, powdered coal and soil. And I want to kind of figure out where I want to lay these out. So if you remember, we have some really great stuff. We have the debris is a good one. We have water as another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bind into each of these. So this is going to be a bind. And I'm going to use water. And be aware, once you've kind of made this, you just need to plug it in everywhere you want to use it. You don't want to drop down a new bind node and call the attribute again. So this is going to be water. So wherever there's water, it's going to use our wild grass. And let's do sediment. No, sorry, this is a bind. And in the bind, we want this to be debris. We'll do sediment here, actually. Sediment. And I'm actually going to reverse these. I'm going to make this be dry rocky ground and make this be into this layer mix. Mossy forest floor. Oh, actually, we're going to do this. Did I reverse those right? I didn't. I want that there, and I want you here. Again, this is just a flavor. There's no right or wrong to this. It just depends on what you're trying to get. So we're going to put down a bind node, and this bind is going to be debris. Okay, now we've got all that kind of chained in the order that I want them. And so let's just swap this in. Let's see what we get. Ah, see, very cool. Now, the transition between these is soft and kind of gross. We would want there to be displacement turn on is going to help with all of this too. But now we're starting to get kind of some interesting stuff where based on these rules, you get these different kind of shaders laying out. So in all of these, their repetition is too low. So let's just take these and select them real quick and go to setting. And we'll make all of these 0.1 to kind of start with. I find that that's a decent place to start. And I'm going to say restart render. Let that kind of recook everything. There you go. So once displacements turn on, that's going to get even more interesting looking. But there you go. There's already some kind of cool stuff happening there. When I look at, I know what these different ones are. So this is our dry rocky ground is this, and I see some big stuff in there, and maybe that's not the right one, you know. So again, with this, I would come and say 0.05, 0.05, and that's going to reduce that down. I don't know that displacement's actually, okay, it is turned on. Okay, so I'm going to go with that. Did that change? I don't know if that changed. What did I just change? That might be dry rocky ground. Here's a great way to test. If you're not sure what shader is what, come into the emission and turn on emission, and you can even add a color, and then you'll know which shader is which, right? It'll come in with an emissive color, right? Okay. So that's not the one that I was thinking of. Good to know. So we'll turn that back off. I'll come back and make this back to 0.1 because we'll leave that. I can see, you know, that's fine. So then that other one, I know this is obviously wild grass. This is like a black color. Maybe that one's it. Yeah, I bet you this is the one. So settings, we're going to change this to 0.05, 0.05, and I'm looking to see kind of some of these frequencies to change. And I think it did. I can check by turning on the emission intensity. Yep, that's the one I wanted to adjust. So, okay, so that's I've now got my kind of my ground laid in there. Now I want to work on my rock up here, and so this is where I'm going to come in and I'm going to use my slope. So I'm going to say slope, bind, and we'll use slope here. See, what are these different rocks? We've got Icelandic sharp rock, jagged shale. So these two should kind of stay together. And so I'm going to put a bind node here. And this one, I'm going to use my general noise 1, and I think I misspelled slope over here. Not slop, but slope. Okay, I'm going to plug not into that one, but from the alpha. Come on, there you go. It's super dangerous to do what I'm doing. It's better to pause the render, make your changes. You know, if it's constantly trying to recook, it will blow up in your face much more frequently. All right, so cool. So now we're going to pull this out, and if before I do that, if I'm wanting to, you know, capture any of this, and I can turn on this cool little snapshot thing here and hit snap, and it'll capture that. And all right, so now we're going to switch this over to here, and we will resume render, and that should give me some differentiation, which in some areas looks a little goofy, right? We've got this dark rock against this really, again, this is where softening those masks a little bit is going to help, but that's okay. We're going to kind of go with this and just let it be this kind of motley quilted pattern for now. It adds some interesting variation. But there we go. So that's kind of set up now. And then with this up here, I want to use a mix of things on this. I'm gonna exclude out some parts, and I'm gonna include others, but let's build out our. So now I've got my kind of my bottom area. So I'm gonna switch up what I'm connected to, and I'm gonna connect to my snow. And so I'm gonna, for this first one, for our windswept snow, I'm just gonna use our general noise that was down here. Except I'm going to plug it into the correct output, and that's our windswept snow and then our snowy stones. All right, so I think these are going to need, oops, that's not what I wanted to connect to. Again, let's pause. Let's make life easier on ourselves. All right, let's make this play nicely. So we'll pull this guy, connect it to our dot. We'll resume our render, and there we go. So now we've got our kind of our snow over stones and our windswept snow. Now both of these, I'm actually going to select all three of these and make an adjustment all at once. So there are 3 selected. We're going to come up here to settings, and we're going to make these 0.1 and 0.1. That seemed to slow it down a little bit, which is a little strange. I'm just going to restart this render. Sometimes you get into a state where it's doing things in a way that you wouldn't expect. This snow must be more expensive. It must have some, based on specularity, no subsurface scattering. All right, I can see in these areas where the general noise is, I can kind of see that the snow over rocks look, and that's cool. I like that. That gives some interesting breakup of not just like pure white snow over the whole thing, and that's great. We've got this extra windswept snow. I'm probably gonna not use that. I think we're gonna just bypass that, and that's gonna cause a restart, which that's fine. So now I'm gonna pause this again, and now I want to pull in that I'm gonna add this ice. So first, let's just plug the ice in and make that our shader. This is this kind of ice wall. I'm gonna change its settings here to be 0.1, and that's just tiling it, right? We're tiling it over it, so we'll see a bunch of, you know, repetition and whatnot. So that's cool. I like that. There's some interesting stuff that happens there. Based on the direction I'm facing in this, I'm actually going to rotate it. I believe this is in degrees, so we'll rotate this 90 degrees, and then we should see it kind of running this way. You know, this is kind of designed, it's not as lovely, but it's fine. We're not going to have it over the whole thing. I think I'm actually going to go smaller. This isn't going to stick out as much as I wanted. I might go back and I might do some stuff with some subsurface scattering on this one to try to make it read a little bit different. But again, at that distance, you're probably not going to see anything. So we'll go with it like this. But now we're going to use another bind node, or we'll use this, we'll use our water. So we're going to come in, where did we use water? There's floor, here's water. So we'll use water, and I should have paused my render, but I did not. And we're going to plug water in there. And now we're going to take this connection here and plug it in there. So in theory, we've got this kind of ice wall in these areas. So let's figure out how we want to connect these two. Right now it's elevation that we're using those. So we're going to move that there and move this here. And we're going to plug our elevation in. Hit save. Wow, the contrast there is not awesome. I would want to, do some things here to make these not feel so, incredibly off from each other. This is so much snow that what I would want to do is come down here and find a snow that, either use a noise pattern to break this up more at this. That way you get something that just feels like it's moving into it. So this will be the next kind of challenge with shading. But for now, we're going to move forward with this. But one of the things I'd love to do is I would love to be able to bring that snow down. Oh, here's actually what we're going to do. We have our peaks and we have our valleys and our occlusion. So we're going to change this to be a bind node, and we're going to use occlusion as our mix here. And we're going to reverse these two. So I'm going to pause this. And the change should be that actually I didn't want to invert those. Sorry, pause again. Because what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to make the snow denser kind of in these little buildups and then less when it's out and exposed, right? There we go. That's nice. Now, one of the things that I can do is I can come in and based on elevation, we could do a second elevation map. In fact, let's do this. So this is going to be kind of the last step for this lesson. We're going to come back out to the stage here. And let's just switch to GL object. Heightfield mountain. And let's go find our elevation. Correction, occlusion, slope. This is our elevation right here. So I'm going to just slide this down, and we're going to make a second elevation node. And to do this, we're just going to change this. So we'll drop this down to, let's do 35 and 45. I think we can come even further. So we're going to come down to 25 and 35. So now we're getting into that kind of valley floor. And then the other thing that we can do is we can increase how much noise we get. So we'll increase that roughness to kind of start breaking up that edge a little bit more. So we get kind of that little sense of pockets of snow at the edges. And that might be interesting. And we'll see. We'll see. That might not work. We might have to back out of that. So but let's try that. So we're going to hit save. And then for this one, we need to add our copy link. Instead of floor, we'll call this elevation 2. Sorry. We're going to come into our shader, our mountain, and we're going to come back to our Karma CPU here, get that base going, then we'll pause it. Oh, I feel like we changed more than we intended. That's kind of what I was going for, but something else. So we're gonna pause this, and we're gonna go back out to our object and look at what we changed here. Okay, so looking at this, here's our elevation mask. Oh, did I change the wrong one? I changed 2 of them at once. That's no good. So we want this one to be, this is our elevation 2. See, this is why we do this. 25 and 30 maybe. What was this guy? 25 and 35. That's fine. So we'll make this 45 and 50. And then this was our original one up here, so I'm just going to swap these out. It'll just be easier since I messed that up. That's the cool thing about Houdini. Look at that. You can just kind of move things around. So cool. Okay. And we need to reverse that. So that's elevation 2. That's elevation. Oh, that's not going to be far enough. I want to move this elevation up. So we're going to make this 75 and 70. Oh, got to go higher. 90, 100, and 80. Let's try that with that little bit of graduation there. And then when we look at this one, this drops down a lot more. And now we can do the same thing with that remap. So let's take this from 30 up to 60, and that'll soften that out a little bit. Might work, might not, but that's kind of what I'm looking for. 50. Okay. We're gonna go back to our stage, go back into our shader here. This should make a change. We are going to drop down a bind node, and this is going to be elevation 2. And what we want to do is we want to, because this elevation node is controlling what's coming on here, we're going to use elevation 2, and we're going to multiply that against like either our occlusion or our water. So let's do both. Let's do that. So we're going to use elevation 2, and we're going to multiply that by our occlusion. So we are using occlusion up here. So we'll multiply those two together, and you could just put them all into one node, but I'm going to use 2 just for visual clarity as to what's happening into there. And now let's resume that render. And this is going to be probably our last step for this evening as far as building this up. Okay. So not quite what I was hoping that it would do. So there's our occlusion. I think this needs to not be a multiply, this needs to be a maximum. So we'll drop that inline right there, and we're just gonna pop that guy right there and delete this guy. There we go. And as you can see, what's gonna happen here is we've now essentially, in those crevices, pulled our snow down further into our environment space. Now we seem to have broken our ground, so we'll have to look into that as to what's happened there. But this is this process of building masks, multiplying them together. You can see here in this area, that soft that we kind of went for doesn't work very well. It doesn't work to have gradients so hot, but we're getting there. We're starting to get to something that's starting to look more interesting. There's probably too much contrast in our valley floor here. That's what we seem to have lost, our valley floor, which is fascinating. All right, well, I went and tried to, as our kind of stuff broke there at the end, we lost our floor attribute, that it wasn't working properly. I went back through and kind of touched up, and I spent a good another half an hour talking, which I'm sure nobody wants to hear anyway. But it came down to just some errors, right? So as I was building the material, sorry, not the material, as I was building the componentry of our object, our output masks, my brain gets all muddled. You can see it's almost 2 in the morning. As I was building these different masks, I ended up reordering this and kind of inserting in the middle of our floor function and broke it. So I went through, corrected that, got it back to the way it was. And so this is generally where I've landed. I went in and brought in a couple of additional materials from the bridge in order to get something that had a little bit more of this kind of breakup feeling. So if we go to the bridge, it's a couple of these guys here. So it's like this glacier and this snow-covered ground. And so that gives us kind of this mix of rock and snow in a way that feels a little more real than this stuff down in here, which is the mask. Now, as this is kind of finishing out, I'm going to go ahead and stop the render. I have some renders that are cached, where we can take a look at the results. So I was able to push the displacement. I went through and added, I guess before we do this, I went through and added on all of the, whoa, come on Windows. Oh boy, what's the hotkey to correct? There we go. So I came in and I added these two extra parameters just by clicking the gear icon here. You can say edit parameter interface, and you can go make custom parameters for controls that you want to add. And so I added a float and I added a toggle. Those are the two different ones that I added, and I just gave them names: displacement, user disp, and true displacement, t-disp. So then that gives me an attribute there that I can add. So then I came down into all of these. I linked by right-clicking on true displacement and saying copy parameter. And then on all of these, I just selected all of my shaders at once. So that should be all of them. And this guy here. And I right-clicked on true displacement and said paste relative reference. Easy peasy. Once I did that, I wanted to add a multiplier to my displacement. So you can see there's the syntax that's used in order to make that connection, right? That relative connection. So there's our user disp instead of our t-disp, and I multiplied all of those by this user disp. Now, as I turned up that attribute, I got more and more displacement on the big rock shaders, these ones here, but I didn't get so much on our less displaced or finer displaced objects, which is these in here and these in here. So my snow, my windswept snow, my glacier, my ice, my grass, my rocky ground, you know, these ones here. So with all of those, I just added an extra 10%, a little 10 time magnification boost, and it kind of balanced those all out. So that's what this is here. I can turn that up and down. Now, the output as to how successful we are, you know, we've hit the limitations of what we can do with the geometry-based approaches for noise patterns. Right? We talked about this earlier in this video about how each point is going to contain data that we're passing then into the shader. So the reality is, if we took this geometry and made a lower res version of it and slapped this shader on it, it's gonna just turn into a mushy mess because we're gonna lose so much of this detail that we're using from the geometry to break this up. I would argue that this kind of area in here is actually working fairly well, especially if we were to push that back. Like if we were to do another layer of mountains back behind this and just kind of drop this setup on those mountains, it would work really well. We can go in and we'll add scatter vegetation on this, and that's going to help kind of sell the realism of this, but there's just a bunch of stuff that's not working. All these little kind of chattery things, those are artifacts from the way we're generating masks and information. So we've kind of tapped out here. There's a lot of stuff that's looking cool, and then there's some stuff that's looking not so cool. So next time we'll dive into how do we take that general idea that we've looked at, where it's really easy to see in the viewport. How do we move that into the shader, which can be a little bit of a slower process as we have to render in order to see what the results are of those choices. So for now, let's recap. We've gone over how to set up an environment, a height field, some techniques for managing our shapes, some techniques for generating masks, and how to mix those materials, those shaders, using those masks. Next time, we're going to refine this even further by doing some shader-based mixing instead of our geometry-based mixing. We'll also lower the resolution of our render geometry and get more detail out of the shader, and so we'll increase the efficiency of memory usage in order to have a better result. We'll also take a look at USD and how to continue in our process of writing out USD files and moving them into their own file. That way we can also save on memory consumption. So we're not doing all of this computation right before rendering and chewing up and holding much of RAM hostage with our computations of building our geometry. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.